Welcome to the International School of Tailoring. My name is Reza and this is going to be your 20th lesson of our How to Make a Bespoke Jacket series. In the previous lesson, we prepared all our panels for further assembly. Before we jump onto canvassing itself, we will have to learn a few fundamentals related to canvassing. Without these fundamentals, canvassing is going to be difficult. So, today's lesson is going to be about relative layer length, which is a subset of relative length. In the upcoming lessons, we are going to assemble the panels and components of our jacket. It is important for you to understand how shape is created when multiple layers are joined together. So, this is what we're going to do. First, I'm going to explain to you the concept of relative layer length. Then I'm going to show you the concept in action, and after that, I'm going to leave you with an assignment. You ready? Let's go. Relative layer length is one of the 5 subsets of relative length. However, it should not be confused with relative length itself. The key word here is layer. Relative layer length is concerned with the creation of shape of multiple layers stacked on top of one another. Relative length, however, is concerned with the creation of any shape on a single or multiple layers. Now, what does relative layer length tell us? It says that shape is created when multiple layers of different lengths are joined together at 2 opposite edges. How does that look like? Imagine that we have one layer here and a layer underneath. We want to secure these 2 layers together by sewing them at 2 opposite edges. So here's going to be one edge and the other edge is going to be here. But before we sew the second edge, what we do is we push the top layer towards the middle, which creates a bubble, like so. Once we have created that bubble, then we go on and secure that edge. What this does, whenever you look at it from the front or the side, depending on where you're standing, what you see is a flat layer sitting on the table with a layer that stands away from the first layer, because this layer has become longer than the layer underneath. Now, whenever you lift this up and you just let it hang, instead of these layers hanging just straight like so, they are going to hang in a curve, because the top layer, being longer, is curling around the layer underneath it, which is shorter. Let's see how this looks on our fabric. Here we have 2 squares of exactly the same size, and I've already secured one end. Before I secure the opposite end, I'm going to push the top layer slightly inwards, like that, to create this bubble. Then I'm going to secure it. So what I've just done is make the top layer longer than the layer underneath between the 2 stitches. This is exactly the same as joining 2 squares that are cut differently from one another in terms of their length. So you can see that this square is longer than the top one. And if I try to align the edges, again, I'm creating that same bubble. Please note that it's very important to have this 2 opposite rows of stitching, because otherwise your bubble will escape and then you don't have that shape. Now, whenever I hold this up, like so, without doing anything, you can already see this is hanging in a curve. Compared to another piece that doesn't have that bubble, compare the differences. You see, we can create this bend shape in 2 different ways. The first way is just as I did, by manually pushing the top layer to make it longer. The other way is to actually hold these 2 layers in a curve, like that, clearing underneath, making sure that there are no bubbles, and then securing them at the edge. What is the difference? And when would you use one over the other? Well, if you're working on something that is small and you can easily hold it in your hands, like for example a lapel, you can perfectly hold these in a curve and then fasten them off or on or secure them however you are doing that. However, if you're working on a very large surface, like the front edge of an overcoat, it's very difficult to really hold that entire front edge in the right curve and secure it, especially if you have smaller hands. So what you do is you determine how much extra length you need, and then you manually push that extra length in on the top layer and then continue securing it. You may wonder, how do I know exactly how much extra length I need? Well, it's very simple. This is what you do. You lay everything flat, and then you take one part of that whole area that you want to have roll, and you just hold it in your hands like a roll, and then you make sure you clear the layer underneath, and then what you do is you put a pin to hold these two layers. When you flatten them again, you will have a small bubble. That bubble is more or less what you need. However, keep this in mind. Sometimes whenever you are securing these two ends as a seam, when these seams fold over, they may take up that bubble that you have. So what you have to do is to put a little bit extra length in that bubble, let's say 1, 2, or 3 millimeters, depending on the thickness of your fabric, to accommodate for that uptaking that the seam requires. Now, sometimes you hear tailors say, we pad the lapels or we pad the canvases and that shapes the layers. Not only is it nonsense, it's just wrong. What shapes these layers is the fact that they are joined at different lengths. The padding stitch is just simply a very comfortable way of holding the layers in a curve and then padding up and down. If you're just holding it in a curve, you can pin those layers and you would still achieve the same effect. You can use any stitch, which is also why machine stitches can achieve the same results as the padding stitch, for example, on lapels. Let me show you. Here I have two examples, the left one being padded by hand and the right one being just simply stitched on a machine. Now, of course, on a proper padding machine, you wouldn't see the rows of stitching at the back, but you get the deal. When I hold them up, like so, both of them hang naturally in a curved way. When I put them on the board, you can see the ends are flicking up and they are pretty much the same. Now that you've seen this, let's do 3 exercises to deepen your understanding. I want you to take a book that you can bend, and then bend it. Once you've bent the book, I want you to hold the open end and see what happens. As you can see, at the bottom we have flat layers, and gradually they become longer and longer, with the longest layer right at the top creating a wave. This is exactly what we did with our fabric. Now I want you to keep holding that end, and what I want you to do is to imagine as if you are cutting all these layers that have moved out and away from the top edge along the top edge. So like this. And the pen that I'm using is from Muji's, and the ink disappears when it's exposed to heat. So I can perfectly draw a few lines here. You can use a pencil if you want. Now, imagine that we have cut everything away. When I let go, you can see that the layers underneath have become shorter and they gradually increase in length until they reach the longest layer. So what's the purpose of this exercise? Well, what I want you to do is to play around with different books of different thicknesses and look at how much you have to bend these books and what the effect is going to be if you keep doing this cutting away simulation as you are bending the book to extremes. So for example, if I would cut them now perpendicular to the top, you can see how severe these differences are. This should give you a good idea of how thicker materials or thinner materials will react to this technique. Now, with the basic bend exercise, I want you to do 2 things. The first one is to simply do what I did in the beginning of the video, which is just push the top layer to the extent that you think you have to push. You can use the distance between the 2 edges as a reference, and then simply baste. Once you've basted the opposite edge, I want you to lift it up and then bend the 2 layers until the gap between them disappears. Now, if you keep on bending and you're almost folding it double and there is still a gap, What you have to think about is whether that gap is there because of a misplacement or because your bubble was way too big. Now in this case, it is a little big, and then the next question is going to be, well, okay, it's big, but imagine that one of these edges is going to be folded over and basted, like the front edge of a jacket, like so. So then I want you to do that. Just fold the edge and baste through all layers. And we're going to pretend that that is a seam that we have machined or we have folded over. Once you've folded that edge over itself, I want you to repeat the step. Fold it over and see if there is still a gap. You will notice that if you fold all of these layers onto themselves, which is what happens on a front edge, for example, or a collar or whatsoever, that a lot of that bubble, a lot of that excess is going to be taken up. Now, a thicker fabric would of course take up a lot more than a thinner fabric, but do this a few times until you get the grasp of it. Now, the second exercise is I want you to take the whole material in your hand instead of working flat and just bend it in your hand as if you would pad a lapel. Just make sure that everything is clear underneath, and you can either use a padding stitch or a running stitch. Let's use a padding stitch on this one. And you can see why the padding stitch is so convenient for this exercise, because it allows you to hold it in a roll and you can simply go up and down without having to twist and bend your arm to do a running stitch. Now, once you've done the securing of the other edge, I want you to just have a look and see how big that bubble is. Again, bend it over and see whether there is a gap. Now, with this one, we don't really have a gap. Now you can already guess, I want you to do exactly the same thing as you did on this edge, and that is to fold over the edge and baste it onto itself. Now, what you'll notice is that almost all of that bubble is gone. So if I would now fold this over, I'm almost creating a bubble on the layer underneath. This could be disastrous on a front edge. So do these exercises on different fabrics with different thicknesses to really understand how different fabrics react to this technique. You don't need to make 20 jackets to understand this. Just do 20 samples of this and you'll get it. The last exercise is called the S-curve, and it's a combination of the basic bend. I want you to take two squares of the same size and run a basting stitch right down the middle. Once you've done that, I want you to bend one side of your square in one direction and the other side in the opposite direction. Now, you can hold this in your hands and baste, or just like we did, you can just manually push the fabric in. I'm going to do this manually. Once you've basted one side, flip it over and again push the fabric in to bend that side in the opposite way. So once you've done that, whenever you hold it up, you can see that these two bubbles want to curve like an S. However, because the top and the bottoms aren't sewn, that effect isn't taken to the extreme. So if I close the top and the bottom, this is how it looks like. Now that the top and the bottom are basted, you can clearly see this curve going like a snake through our material. The whole purpose of this exercise is to show you that you can combine the basic bend in different ways to create more complicated shapes. Do keep in mind that we always need two parallel lines whenever we trap a bubble in between. So if I would remove the middle line, we would just end up with nothing, or just simply one bubble on one side. So if you want to make this permanent, you would have to make a permanent stitch right down the middle as well. That's all. Here's a summary for you. Shape is created when multiple layers of different lengths are joined together at opposite edges. That is the essence of relative layer length. I want you to do the exercises that I've given you because they allow you to focus purely on the techniques and test them out with different variables. You won't be able to do that when you're making a full jacket. If this video brought value to you and you'd like to help us in return, you can. You can do that with a small donation on the donations page of our website. You can find the link to that page in the description of this video. We are planning to make the International School of Tailoring truly an international place for worldwide tailoring knowledge, available and accessible to everyone. My name is Reza. This was today's lesson, and I look forward to seeing you in the next one. Take care. Now, as you've as you've just my name is Reza. This was today's